If you've never done a hardwood floor before, just set it in. It's really not that difficult. And drive it home. One of the nice things about oak flooring is it's a commodity, and you can get solid oak at a very reasonable price. But it does take some basic carpentry skills to install a floor. I've designed this tape for someone who's never really done their own hardwood floor or knows what it's about. Wood flooring is hard work. There's no question about it. If you're willing to do that and take your time, you can turn out a real nice product. Hi, I'm Don Bollinger. We're out here in the country at my home just south of Seattle, Washington. We're standing out in front of the stables here because they're taking the last few bits of underlayment off our subfloor in preparation to put down this new oak flooring. What we're installing is this 3/4 by 2 1/4 inch tongue and grooved and in-matched #1 common red oak flooring from Bruce. My wife and I like it because of all the mineral streaks and grain and color variation. Makes a nice, pretty floor. Every board is different. But you know, this commodity oak isn't your only choice when you have a wood floor. Oak comes in a variety of widths and thicknesses, from a wide oak plank down to a narrow strip, and from very narrow and thin 5/16 inch strips that are not tongue and grooved up to 3/8 and 1/2 inch tongue and grooved and in-match strips. But even if you don't want oak, there's a lot of softwood varieties that people also like. If you live out in the country like we do, and you don't want to have an oak floor or can't afford one, you might want to consider car decking. You can put it right over 4 foot or 6 foot on center sleepers and finish the surface floor, and later when you can afford it, put new oak flooring on top of that like we are. Other softwood choices are fir or pine, like this antique heart pine here. This is all reclaimed out of old buildings in the Midwest to the East Coast, and it's very, very solid material. It's very stable, and some people call it slash pine or longleaf heart pine. You know, if you're looking for something totally different to choose from, there are hundreds and hundreds of exotics. We've got just a few laid out here for you, like this wide or narrow walnut, or hickory, or just plain white oak, or this cherry from Brazil, or ironbark from Australia, and this acrylic impregnated red oak here, or just teak. Over here we have parquet. These are very simple patterns of parquet. They come in hundreds of different styles and patterns. Here we have unfinished oak and pre-finished teak. These are real simple for the do-it-yourselfer to install, especially the pre-finished varieties. And you can put them down directly over your slab without putting an underlayment down. These pieces of parquet are held together with pieces of webbing, and you just simply put that right down into the adhesive. Now over here we have a floating plank. That's right, floating. This is so well milled that all these pieces fit very tightly together, and they can be glued or just slipped into place. You can have that strip flooring look right on top of a slab without an underlayment. Now, it's not a big thickness of material, so you can't refinish it very often, but you can have a wood floor right on the slab. And it's apropos that the last sample I have to show you here today is the same material we're going to be installing in my house. Only this is pre-finished. So if you don't feel capable of sanding and finishing your own floor, but you do feel like you can install it, you might want to pick up this product. Let's go see what's happening in the house. Well, just over 3 years ago, my wife Bonnie and I moved in here with our dog Kodiak, and most of the house was carpeted. We decided we wanted more hardwood, so we pulled up the carpet, pad, tack strip, and particle board during the past week, and really got a lot of blisters from it. What we've done is we've had to re-nail a lot of the car decking to hold it in place. Over here, out of the way, we've had our hardwood flooring acclimating for the past week. It should be just about the right moisture content now for installing. In front of it, we have all the tools and supplies we're going to need for installing the wood flooring. I'll talk about each of these individual tools as we go to use them. The largest room we're going to be installing is the living room, which we're now in. It's about 15 by 17. And the focal point in the living room is the hearth. And around the hearth we're going to put a 5-inch plank border with a little ebony and brass inlay to really set it off. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. The flooring will be running 90 degrees to the car decking, so it'll flow right on into the dining room, which is the second largest room we're going to be doing. It also has the car decking, as you can see. The flooring will continue going like this right up on into the kitchen. We're going to do the kitchen as well. Wood flooring really makes an excellent floor surface. Easy to keep clean for the kitchen. You might notice the refrigerator pushed out here a bit. I've saved a little bit of that underlayment that was really a pain to pull out. In fact, we'll show you how to pull that out right now. Before we can remove this final piece of underlayment, we're going to have to remove the remaining pieces of base molding. I might like to use a sharp spackle knife like this. It's somewhat flexible, at the same time stiff enough so we can pry the base molding away from the wall. This helps remove the base enough where I can get a pry bar behind it and helps keep the paint from pulling off with the base. Then I switch to this small pry bar, prying it ever so gently away from the wall to keep from marring the sheetrock. Once we get it pried away from the wall, the next thing we'll do is we'll mark it. This number I'm marking on the back of this piece will correspond to a number I'll mark on the wall. That way I'll know where it goes. Since the underlayment runs underneath the cabinets, unless you're going to remove the cabinets, you're going to have to chisel around the cabinets. You want to be sure and use an old chisel when you're doing this, as you're likely to hit a few nails. Now this shorter chisel worked fine here where I could get at it, but when you have to get underneath the toe kick like I did here earlier, you need a long bladed chisel like this boat chisel or a turning tool where you can reach underneath the toe kick without getting the handle in the way. Now the hardest part of this process is getting the underlayment pulled up. That is not what you want to do. One of the problems with this particle board is it doesn't want to come up in big pieces, especially when you've got these ring shank nails in it. Just about got it up. Right along where I scored it along the cabinets. You can see it's just about pulled it up. Oh, broke off pretty clean. A little more clean up there with a chisel and I think we'll be just fine. Well, I've just put a bunch of 16 pennies in this 2x6 car decking, helped to tighten it up a little bit. It's hemlock and it really has spaced apart and twisted up quite a bit. Once you pull up the underlayment, it's an excellent time to tighten up your subflooring, because really a hardwood floor is only as good as its underlayment. Ordinarily in this floor I would use 1/2-inch plywood on top of it. It'd provide a much more solid surface throughout the whole area, and I'd hold it down with 2-inch ring shank nails throughout. The problem with that on this floor is I've got hardwood flooring in other areas of the house, actually in 3 other bedrooms and a bathroom, and I don't want to have a 1/2-inch threshold in each one of the doorways. So I'm going to try to make this as good as I can. 2 things you have to look out for in an underlayment in a subfloor: high and low spots. The low spots you can mark with a pen and later mark them with paper if you're going to cover the floor. The high spots you have to take down with a sander. This is a really bad board here. This is in a real bad spot too, right in front of the hearth, so it's a good 5/16 of an inch below the board next to it. What I want to do is I'm going to mark this now, and I want to have a place so I can come back later and mark the paper on top of it. Or this board is so bad I might even put a 5/16 shim in there. Well, I've got another big hole over here. Actually, it's all the way down to the tongue, so I want to make sure that I mark that one as well. Well, I've got the depressions marked now. Now I have to work on the high spots. And I've got a real good example of that right here in the hearth. I've got a high spot that runs with this board all the way around the hearth. So I'll have to take that down with the edger. Always be absolutely sure you have any visible nails set prior to doing any sanding. If you don't, you'll end up tearing the paper and maybe the equipment. It'll cost you a bundle when you take it back to the rental store. For taking out high spots in the subfloor, there's nothing like using an edger or a spinner like the one you see I'm using here. Of course, a belt sander will work in a pinch, but it's a lot slower than the edger. It's real common to have high spots running around the hearth. If you don't take these out before you lay flooring, you're likely to find you have these projecting through on your border in your finished floor later. My car decking subfloor in my hallway and dining room had a lot of ridges in it that I had to take down, so I elected to use a drum sander. This runs on 220 volts and is 12 inches wide. These might be a little bit difficult to find in a rental yard, but you're sure to find an 8-inch, 110-volt variety. Also, if you're planning on sanding your own hardwood floor, you'll find this really useful practice before you start working on the real thing later on. If your subfloor is ridged or heavily cupped like mine was, running diagonal to the grain is sometimes helpful. There's more on how to use both the big machine and the edger in my sanding and finishing tape. Well, I think we've got that subfloor just about as flat as we're going to get it. We've drawn out a diagram here of the area that we're working in to maybe give you a better idea of what we're working with. These lighter areas represent the areas we're going to be putting new flooring into. We're standing just about here. This area right in here is where the refrigerator goes. Remember, we pulled out the underlayment in there. The bathroom and these 3 bedrooms all have existing oak flooring in them. And that's one of the reasons we've been spending a whole lot of time on the subflooring. We want to be able to have the same height in all these doorways. I want to take you down here now in front of the bathroom. I want to show you one more detail with the door jamb that we have to deal with. I'm in the bathroom doorway here now, and this is the line of the existing flooring. I may put another board in here to match the existing header that's in here. But whatever I do, I'm going to have to address the issue of the height of the door jamb to the existing flooring. As you can see, the new flooring is going to be higher than the door trim. So what I'm going to need to do is to cut that off. And without removing it, it can be difficult. I like to use a jam saw. You can see it's very flush on the bottom here. And I can come right up against it using a scrap piece of material and cut it right out. Notice I've got duct tape protecting the existing finish in the bathroom. And I'm using a couple of pieces of scrap flooring here to keep my saw on an even plane. I can fix that chip piece with glue later on. I think I'll finish this out with a chisel. Let's see what the fit looks like. Oh, it looks pretty good. Well, as you can tell, the hand jam saw works quite well. But when you've got a lot of door jambs to cut, we've got 5 in here, plus this cabinet facing here, and a lot of sheetrock we're going to cut out to leave extra expansion space, you might want to get an electric jam saw. I've got a cabinet facing here across the hallway. I'll trade places with the cameraman, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. As you can see, the tool is designed so that it can cut flush. Or, with these wing nut adjustments on the side, it can be adjusted to whatever height you like. In our case, 3/4 of an inch. The fence here is also adjustable, so you can adjust to whatever depth of cut that you like. Now, although this is a very useful and helpful tool, it is also a very dangerous one. You can see there's not very much of a guard here. And there's a lot of torque to the machine, so you want to make sure you have both hands tight on it before you start using it. An electric jam saw can really come in handy if you've got a lot of trim to cut, particularly if that trim happens to be metal. At our house, it was especially helpful because we wanted to undercut the sheetrock to give our flooring an extra 5/8 inches of expansion space. You know, a lot of water is good to wash with, and some is even good to drink, depending on where you live. But water and wood just don't mix. About 90% of the problems that you have with hardwood flooring come from too much moisture. It's a very good idea to check the moisture content, not only of the oak that you're bringing in, but also of the subfloor, prior to introducing it to the house. What you're looking for is a good balance. You're not looking for whether it's too wet or too dry, but a good balance between the subfloor and the material you're going to be installing over it. We've checked this material when we brought it in. I'm getting a reading about 8 to 10 moisture content with this little moisture meter I'm using. I'm using a mini lignomat. This type of moisture meter is about $100, and if you don't own one or don't want to buy one, I recommend highly that you borrow one from your wood dealer. Our subfloor is running about 8 to 10% moisture content, well within the range of what we need to have. For comparison purposes, I brought in a piece of flooring from my garage. It's been undercover, but unheated for a number of months. And you can see it's running about 12 to 14% moisture content. That's too wet to install on this subfloor. It'd have to acclimate for a long period of time before it would be ready to install. Otherwise, we might have problems. To give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about here, I've drawn out a couple of diagrams. This first one is a real good example of a balanced type of installation, where the surface floor and the subfloor have been really well acclimated. They're equal or very near equal in moisture content. In this type of installation, you get a flat surface and a tight floor, and it stays that way as long as the environment stays the same. These next two are examples of where the floor has received some type of moisture impregnation. It could be from spilling something on the floor, it could be from moisture coming up from underneath. This first one is typically an example of where there's a trauma, or where a floor has been flooded or some water's been spilled on the floor. The second here is an example of where the moisture typically has come up from the subfloor, or it may have come up from an uncovered crawl space area. Once these moisture damaged floors start to dry out, we have what is a very unsightly type of an effect, or large cracks developing between the boards. This comes primarily because of the crushed grain that occurs in here, compressed or compacted grain, and it'll never be the same again. You'll have these large cracks, and it's unsightly, but it's also not structurally sound because the boards are nailed here on the leading edge in most rows, and as they separate, the back edges of the boards start to lift up. Of course, every house and every region of the country is different, but even without these kinds of excessive moisture impregnations, you have to expect a certain amount of expansion and contraction in your wood floor. To allow for that, we have to have an expansion gap around the floor. Once we get a few boards installed, I'll show you what that expansion gap might look like. Now that we've prepared the subfloor, we're ready to talk a bit about layout. We said earlier that our car decking was running in an east-west direction in our floor. That means that our new flooring would have to run in a north-south direction. Now, in most instances, we would run from the widest to the most narrow part of our installation area. In our particular instance, that would mean we would run along this wall, the dining room, living room combination, and we would work towards the back bedroom doorway. One of the most important factors in laying out any floor is to determine the outer squareness of the rooms. There's no such thing as a square room. At least I know I've never met one. And ours is no different. I know from measurements I've taken earlier that if we were to reference our starting line parallel with this wall, we would end up with wedges something like this as we approached the opposite walls. We want to try to eliminate that if possible, or at least reduce it. In order to do that, we need to change our reference point. We need to modify it. So we establish a baseline. Now, this baseline takes into account this outer squareness of these rooms, but more importantly in our layout, it needs to take into account this focal point in the living room. It needs to make that border look good. I'll go lay out that line right now. Okay, I've marked my baseline with the help of my friend Dale here. Our baseline runs from the dining room wall all the way through into the opposite wall in the living room. We're fortunate in that our baseline is perfectly parallel with our hearth and the leading edge of our border around the hearth. And as it turns out, helps also to average out some of the wows in the walls that give us our outer squareness in our rooms. The next thing we're going to do is to install the border around the hearth by gluing and screwing. For a more precise fit, actually mark the board you're going to be installing rather than measuring. If you're using wide plank for headers like we're doing here, you might find a radial arm saw will come in handy. Here Dale is marking the plane along which we'll insert the screws to attach the header. We're using a Fuller Type C bit here to drill our pilot hose and countersink. We'll be using a 2-inch flat-headed wood screw with a square drive to attach the header here. These are quite efficient when you're doing floor work. After dry fitting this leg of the header around my hearth, I noticed I had a high spot here I needed to take down with the edger before I could set it in place permanently. Just a couple more screws here and we'll have it down tight. If you look close, you'll notice a bit of a gap along the leading edge of the mitered portion of the inlay. I've done this intentionally so that it will tuck tight when the flooring is laid against it. Well, except for topping off the screw holes with wooden plugs that we've cut earlier, we're pretty much done with the border and inlay around the hearth. I thought I'd talk to you a bit about the inlay that we've used and the border. The inlay we've used is a combination of brass and ebony, two of the more difficult types of inlays to use, but also two of the more opulent. We pre-drilled the brass and the ebony for the finish nails that attach it to the yoke. You notice we've taken the tongue off the one side so that we can attach the inlay. And on the other side, we've cut out a rabbet so it will fit tighter against the hearth. Before we can install our first few rows of flooring, we need to lay down our craft paper. That's a vapor barrier that's 2 layers of asphalt sandwiched in between 3 layers of craft paper. You want to overlap your seams by a good 6 inches or more, just to ensure proper coverage. Remember that low spot in the floor that I showed you earlier and marked with a magic marker? Well, I want to mark that again on top of our paper so that we don't have any flooring seams end up on top of it. All right, I've just put the first row of flooring in place using my baseline here as a guide. I've transferred the baseline from underneath the paper on top of the vapor barrier paper here. You might notice that I haven't laid out more than a couple rows of paper here. I don't like to do that because it usually just gets in the way transferring the tools back and forth. After I finish nailing, I like to double check to make sure that I still have a nice straight line. What I've done is I've positioned each one of these boards equal distance from the baseline. I'm just checking now for the measurement to make sure that my nailing has not knocked any of the boards out of place. It's very important that each board in this first couple of rows be very straight, and that's quite a feat. You might notice I had to go through several bundles of material in order to get those first few boards. It's not so important as you get out in the middle of the floor to have very straight boards. You can have bent and curled boards, and believe me, you'll get them. But these first couple of rows have to be face nailed into place. They're too close to the wall to be blind nailed. One of the methods I use for this is this pneumatic nailer. It has a large rack for nails, and it has a safety point here in the tip that must be depressed before it'll actually operate. It has a number of advantages. One of the advantages is it's lighter, and it's faster, and one of the things I really like about it is the nail heads are smaller. Probably the most common type of face nailer is this manual face nailer. It also has a clip for nails. It's held in by a spring here. And it's activated by driving this plunger into the board with a mallet like this. Now, I didn't sink the nail all the way into the board so I could show you what the nail is like. The nail it drives has an L-shaped head and barbed sides that really make this baby hold well. The only problem with a face nail is that when it's sunk into the board, it leaves a hole that must later be filled. Whenever possible, I like to use a blind nailing method. That is, driving the nail down at an angle just above the tongue. Now, because we're so close to the wall, the only way we can blind nail is by hand nailing or by using the pneumatic finish nailer. I'll use it to nail on the second row. Once our first row is secured, we can begin blind nailing our second row. Notice the color variation between boards here. Expect a lot of color variation in wood flooring, particularly in number 1 common like what we're using here. The gap between the wall and the first row is intentional. That's our expansion gap. It tapers here from the dining room towards the wall in the living room. This will hopefully make up for a lot of the out of parallelness between our two facing walls. It will also serve to make our leading edge of our hearth look good, which is our primary focal point in the room. Now that I've got a couple of rows installed, I can begin using the side nailer. The side nailer works in much the same way as the top nailer does, with the plunger driving the nail in and sinking the board in one action. It drives the nails in at a 45-degree angle through the top of the tongue, or blind nails it. But better than that, it has a lip on here that helps to drive the board tight at the same time. As you can tell, once you start blind nailing with one of these power nailers, you can really start to pick up some speed. That is until you reach that right wall, if you're right-handed. Just don't get your fingers between the bricks. We like to rack out a floor laying out in advance. Helps us speed up the laying process. It gets us down in there close where we can see where the seams are. We don't like seams to be any closer than 6 inches. And we don't like to have any H's develop. H's are when we have two in-butts directly across from each other with only 1 or 2 rows separating them. You don't want tight joints like this either. This is far too close. This is not good from a structural stability standpoint or from a look standpoint. You want them at least 4 to 6 inches apart. One final thing you want to avoid is staircasing. That's when you get 5 or 6 rows strung out like this in a tiered fashion, looking something like a staircase. Most rows don't require cutting at more than one end. So when we're racking out a number of rows, we turn the boards around so that we preserve the groove on the ends.
Power miter boxes or cutoff saws, like the one you see Dale using here, are used extensively by wood flooring installers. They're especially useful for tight fitting, like what we're doing here around the inlay at the hearth. Once you get the flooring started, you can start racking out and really develop a rhythm and flow to your nailing. When you pick up your wood flooring at your wood flooring dealer, you'll be given short, medium, and long length boards. Be sure as you're racking out the floor that you give equal representation to all of these. Otherwise your floor will look strange. A few more nails here now and we'll have this section of the floor complete. Several manufacturers have come out with air assist side nailers in recent years, like this Primatech nailer you see me using here. They certainly don't make the job go any faster, but they do take a lot of the physical labor out of the nailing process. One of the things I like about this particular nailer is it uses regular flooring nails, as opposed to staples as some of the air assist side nailers do.
Well, we've got this section of the floor finished. We've gone about as far as we can go now. We'll need to start the next row, then we'll need to scribe around the border of the hearth.
And we followed our baseline carefully here, so we should come out equal on both sides.
Oh, great, it looks perfect. Oh, you're probably saying, well, another contrived videotape where everything comes out perfect. Well, yours can too, as long as you keep your baseline and your flooring perfectly in line.
And once again, we're using the actual board we'll be installing to mark the position of our cuts. This will make for a more precise fit. One of the many uses of a combination square is to mark your depth of cut, as Dale is doing here. Now, many pros will actually freehand this, as Dale is doing here, but I recommend you use a straight edge for this purpose. One of the tricks used by professional flooring installers when making highly visible cuts like this one is to undercut slightly and on a bit of a bias. This way the board will tuck tight when more flooring is laid against it. A saber saw helps complete our cut. Here, however, Dale needs to cut right on the line. Adjusting the tool to cut on a slight bias is still not a bad idea. When we nail in the second row in front of our border, it will help to snug up our joints, particularly tighten that fit around our miters. Part of the beauty of a wood floor is the color and grain variation like you see here.
As you can see, this is the area we've marked, and I make certain that we don't get any joints in the low spot of the floor.
Now that we've got a few feet of flooring installed, I'd like to talk a bit about the expansion gap and the need for one. Hardwood floors really need a lot of area to expand and contract in. Of course, the type of expansion gap that you need will vary depending on the wood. Now, with this type of material that we're using here, this is #1 common red oak. It's flat sawn or plain sawn. You can figure about a 1/16 of an inch of movement for every running foot across grain. Now this is across grain in this direction. So if we have a 16 by 20 room and the flooring is running in this direction along the 20-foot length, you can figure on a ½ inch on this side of the room and another ½ inch on this side of the room to give you your full inch of movement. Now 20 years ago, when most homes were filled with hardwood, the expansion gap was taken for granted. Not only was the lath and plaster or sheetrock held up off the subfloor, allowing for expansion and contraction of the flooring underneath it, but most homes were trimmed out with a base board and with a base shoe. This allowed a lot of space and plenty of room for a house full of hardwood to expand and contract underneath it. But in today's homes, not only is the sheetrock set right on the subfloor all too often, but very often they use a very fine or slim line single piece base molding like this one. That's just not enough expansion gap. So we like to have you hold up sheetrock, and if you're only going to be using one piece of molding, that gives you at least an inch of expansion for the floor. If you don't leave that expansion gap, what you're going to get is the flooring is going to push against the sheetrock, have no place to go, and you'll end up with a cupped floor, just from normal expansion contraction. Now this expansion gap you see here doesn't look like the ½ inch that I said we needed, but we've actually undercut the sheetrock so the flooring can expand underneath it. I'll show you that in greater detail when we get to the other side of the room. Okay, we've just finished laying flooring up here to the edge of the heat duct in the dining room. And rather than just cutting out the vent hole here and later inserting a metal register, I like using a wood register. A flush fitting register is my favorite, and we put a border around that like you see and screw it and plug it in place. And the flush fit register goes right in here like this. I really like these. My friend Jack makes these down at Wood Air Systems in Portland, Oregon. You know, rather than using this, you can also go with a retrofit, or you can cut the hole out and just slide these on top if you think the border is too much of a problem. In this particular instance here, we've had some problems. As we talked about earlier, we had a lot of really rough spots in the subflooring, and we're having to staple some cardboard here. I've used file folders. We've stapled them into place to help level this border area out here. Well, we're doing this carefully so that it remains square, and it's quite difficult to do that with this subfloor in the condition that it's in. Ooh, smooth. Real good. Isn't that nice? Well, now that this border is in place, we have a bit different situation for the end of our rows. We notice that we have the groove situated on the outside of the border all the way around. We've done that intentionally so that the end of our rows can go in with the tongue into this groove. That way we don't have a single weak line all along here with the floors moving. On this outside it really doesn't matter because we're kind of running wild here at the edge of the wall. We will make our cuts out here at various different spots staggered so that we maintain the continuity of our tongue and groove. Now these have to be fairly precise cuts. So we need to mark them and cut them at a slight bias so that they'll slide into place. Whoa, I'll tell you what. Now you're probably saying, I wonder how many cuts this guy had to make to really put this on film. But it was the first cut, first time. All right. Mighty fine. All right. Over here in the living room, on the starting end of the row, we have another grate, and we've also got grooves on all around its border as well. Only here we have the opposite problem. The starting end of the rows have a groove. So in order to lock those into place, we use a spline. It slides into the grooves here on the border, and then when the boards are placed in, they lock into place as well. one of the nice things about these nested bundles is the boards are almost racked out. I can't have that. Put it aside. Make it a starter board. Okay, that'll work. Tongue off this guy. Slide it in there.
When we have a tight fit at both ends of the row, like we do here, we have to center fit or work from both ends towards the middle to maintain a tongue and groove along the headers or borders that we've got. Center fitting requires precise work, so you'll need to make sure your boards are well aligned with previously installed boards when marking for these cuts. You'll need to remove the tongue and groove off both ends of the boards to be fit. A scrap piece of flooring set in the chop saw like this will give a slight bias to our cut, making the fitting easier. Then all we have to do is tap the board into place and nail it home. As I said earlier, it's best to maintain the tongue and groove integrity between boards whenever possible, especially along contiguous joints. Ideally, we'd use a router or other device to make a groove in the boards we've had to cut to fit around these borders. This would take considerably longer, and I opted to secure the unnailed sides of the boards with a chlorinated solvent adhesive. Then fasten the tongue side in place by blind nailing. A single thin strip here on the wall side of the dining room vent, rather than all these little small pieces, would have been a lot easier and faster. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Can you see the difference? When pulling the walls, that is finishing up a room as Dale is doing here next to the dining room side of our kitchen cabinets, cut and dry fit all your boards first, then pry them tight and face nail them into place. Using a pry bar against a scrap piece of flooring like this really helps to do this. Using the mallet to bounce on the boards will tend to chatter them into place. Ordinarily, only a couple rows will have to be face nailed, but due to the limited working room under the counter here, a bit more face nailing was necessary. Just a few more rows now and Dale will have the dining room complete. Then he'll need to reestablish the baseline in the kitchen. To do this, he'll use the last few boards he's finished installing as a guide. First, he must cut and dry fit a straight board that becomes our first row in the kitchen. That done, he can sight down it to get an approximate placement. To confirm its position, however, he'll use a chalk line that runs along the leading edge of his last row, then bring his new board into alignment with it. Once this line is established, he can custom cut shims to hold it into position, apply adhesive to the subfloor to hold down the back side of the board, and we'll blind nail this board into place. In order to do that, we'll have to put some shims behind it so that it doesn't kick back out of alignment. Drills pilot holes, and hand nails it into place. After 2 to 3 carefully secured rows are in place, Dale is able to once again pick up speed with the side nailer. Even in fairly tight areas like my kitchen, you can develop a rhythm and flow with your nailing if you properly rack out the flooring in front of you. When working around corners or fitting boards into tight slots, it frequently becomes necessary to remove the back side of the groove to get the board to fit. When you do, cut off only enough of the groove to allow you to fit the piece into place.
Whoa, looks like we've got a skinny board here. Well, normally these things are milled pretty well, but even a 32nd of an inch, which looks like what we have here, looks like a large crack to the eye. And I think we should pull it out. It's right in the middle of the hallway. It's going to be real obvious. I'm going to have to pull out these two boards, but I think it'll be worth it. While I'm stopped here, I think I'll show you one other problem with the milling. On the ends of the board, sometimes you get these little wedge-shaped pieces where the ends don't match up quite right. We've got one here, but it's a fairly minor one. I'm going to leave that in the floor. When you get something that's this severe, and believe me, you'll get them, you'll probably want to pull them out of the floor, hopefully before you nail them in. Well, I hate to pull this board out, especially it's such a nice long board. And also I've nailed the devil out of it. But got to. There we go. Well, I could save this board clipping off these ends here, but I really don't want to. It's too much work. I've got plenty of lumber.
In the doorway here where the kitchen and living room meet, the purpose and positioning of our baseline again become really apparent. If we followed our baseline well, and I believe that we have, we shouldn't be more than a 32nd of an inch off. Dale's taking measurements now to determine how much, if any, we are off.
Boy, that's almost perfect. Now if this wouldn't come out, you would take a block plane and you'd take about, let's say, a 32nd of an inch off of the board. And that should make it come out. But if it's more, you need to take about that much off each board for about a foot or two back. Okay, I'll notch this board here so it'll go around the end of the wall. The reason this is here is I couldn't get a good swing on the nailer here. The next board should suck this up tight.
Just a few more rows here. We'll pull up the wall and we'll be done in the living room, then we can finish up the hallway. We'll be done with this monster. You want to make sure you get some nice straight boards when you're doing your last few rows. Otherwise, you'll have a real pain on your hands. It's real tough when you get this close to the walls, both on you and the walls, when you're trying to use a side nailer. Show you what happens. Now, I just can't get a good enough stroke to sink this guy in. I'll have to hand nail it in and use an automatic nailer for the rest of the rowing here until I get up real close. But I'll only be able to use it a bit more blind nailing, and then I'll have to switch to top nailing with it for my last couple rows.
Even with the air nailer, you could probably tell I'm leaving a few faint marks along the wall. When nailing down flooring, expect to do some paint and sheetrock touch-up.
Sometimes when you're pulling up to the wall, you have to use your friendly persuader here. I call it the long arm next to the wall. Pretty. Now, when I'm closing in on the wall like this, I can rarely finish with a full board. I usually end up with a rip. Here I've got about an inch, and that's wide enough for me to nail into place. But if I were to end up with, say, a half-inch rip or smaller, I'd want to glue it onto this leading edge of the board before I nail it into place, and I'd nail them into place together then. I always like to have a little 3-inch wide material on hand for pulling up the walls, as if you do have a real narrow rip, you don't have to glue it in place, you can nail it in place that way. And also the wows in the wall show less with 3-inch wide material. We've got about 17 feet here across the living room, and we have a tight fit against the hearth. So I've cut the sheetrock here so that the flooring can slide underneath it. It gives us another 5/8-inch expansion gap here at the wall. And we need this because this is the only expansion gap we have between here and the hearth. Now if you're doing a new installation, of course we're retrofitting here, but if you're doing a new installation and you've got a lot of hardwood going in, you might want to have the sheetrockers hold that sheetrock up off the floor 3/4 of an inch so you'll have that extra 1/2 or 5/8-inch expansion gap. Ordinarily, I like to try to pull all my rows tight together and nail them at the same time. But if you've got some really weak sheetrock or some nasty boards that you're having to pull tight, you might want to try this method. One thing to keep in mind, though, when you use this, is you want to use a real long board here so it spans a number of studs. You can really put on a lot of pressure on it with this.
Whenever possible, try to position face nails in the softer, more porous, early growth portions of boards. When these holes are filled and finished, they'll usually be hidden more effectively.
Down the other end of the living room, I've got a fairly straight rip. But on this end of the living room, it really wows out here. So I've had to cut a pretty wedge-shaped board here. And I've done that so I can remain with a 1/2-inch gap all along the wall line here. When you just got a rip or your boards are fairly tight, you can use this method with the pry bar to pull your boards in tight.
Just one last board and our living room's done.
Okay, I think that's about as far as I can go, where I can put in my nosing here at the top of the steps. I prepared this nosing with brass and ebony, just like I did at the sliding glass door with the header there. I thought I'd show you what a nosing looks like and how it functions. A nosing is normally about 3.5 inches wide. You might notice the full round bull nose here, and it's 1 1/16 wide right here, so it matches treads that you'd put on your steps. You might notice the rabbet cut out here. It's cut back to 3/4 of an inch here, so it will match your 3/4 inch flooring. This rabbet cut also helps to trim out the riser that comes up like this on the steps. The way I've laid this out is I've figured this cut by squaring off the side and back of my existing skirt. I figured this cut here by squaring off my wall lines on both sides here. You might notice I've run past the wall line a bit and I dive into the wall. I want to show this nice little trim out here with my brass and my ebony. That way my brass and ebony has a place to go, and I'll hold my base molding back a bit so that I show this detail. I'll have to touch up my sheetrock here a bit, but I think this detail will be worth it.
Since this is the primary focal point at the top of my stairway, I wanted an extremely tight fit. I measured closely for it, and I got what I wanted. I don't mind a little paint touch-up later.
You might notice that this screw is into the nosing here at somewhat of an angle. I've done that with all of the screws here on the leading row on the nosing here, and that's because the nosing overlaps the riser by a good 1.25 inches. And I want these screws to go in and bite into the riser as well as into the joist that runs along the head of the steps here. One last screw here. All right. Down in tight. Looks good. All right. Not enough force, I can go up here to the doorway. You might see I've laid flooring into the closet here. That had flooring at one time. And we pulled that out since it was such a small area so we could lay flooring all the way through into it. I put a 3-inch board back there to help me lay back the wall without having to cut a rip in there. You might notice in this doorway here we have old flooring, and this is where I was talking about not wanting to put extra underlayment on here because it would raise this above my existing flooring level, and I'd have to have a reducer from my new height down to this floor. Rather than lacing into this floor here, what I've done is I've come up with a 5-inch header, and I've done 4 and 5-inch headers in each one of these existing doorways so that I can just lay flooring up to that.
I've used screws and plugs here like I've done in all the rest of my headers, both for looks and stability. You may notice it's about 1/8 of an inch higher than my existing floor. Most of this is due to settling. I've found the same effect in our master bedroom doorway, but it's mostly hidden by carpet. After a good deal of thought, I decided just to leave it. I could sand it level during a future sand and refinishing.
Well, we're pulling up to the end of the floor now, and as I mentioned to you earlier, the two most important points, focal points in the floor, are the hearth and this doorway. And you might notice here, we're tight fitting to an existing floor here, so it's very important we get as square as we possibly can. Now, I've left this space here so that if I have to take a little bit off each board to make the boards come out, I can do that. And I'll take some measurements now and just see how far out I am. I'd like to end up with a full board if I can, or close to it. If not, I might use a 3-inch plank, but I don't want to end up with a little rip. All right, 13, I'm about 1/8 of an inch off full board here, and 3/16 here. It's great. Okay, so I should be able to take one of these full-length boards and take 1/8 of an inch off this end and taper to 3/16 on this end, and then take the tongue off the board next to it and top nail it right in. Okay, this is the board that I took the taper cut off of, and I've already fit it into place here, and I really can't tilt it up here because it's underneath the door trim here. So I've taken the tongue off this board so it'll fit into that tapered board, and on the back side I've taken the back of the groove, or the underside of the groove, off so I can fit it into place without taking this leading tongue off of this board.
Retrofitting a hardwood floor is much more difficult than installing a floor in a new house. But even with the extra time and effort it takes, I think the end result is more than worth it.
Well, as you can tell by now, installing a hardwood floor involves a lot of hard work. But with some minor carpentry skills and a little patience, and in probably less than a week's time, you too can have a floor that looks like this. I tell you, we're really going to love this hardwood in the kitchen. It's really easy to keep clean. The dining room here is especially nice too. I like the way the grate looks in here. But the coupe de grace here is the border around the hearth. I'm just tickled to death with it. It really came out looking nice. It took a long time, but the brass and the ebony really are set off with the fireplace. I'm just real pleased with it. And it ties in too with the way we've done the header around the sliding door here too. Well, there's just one final thing here to do, and that's put the plugs in our grates and headers, and I'll show you how to do that right now. To finish off the floor, we have these 1/2-inch cut plugs. And you might note I like to set the plugs cross-grain. That does a couple things. One is it helps to highlight the plug in the floor, and secondly, you don't have to worry about grain alignment this way. When you've got a lot of plugs, it really makes a difference. Just use a little bit of glue in there and just set it in and drive it home. Now we'll come back later when the glue is dried and we'll edge this flush with the floor so that there's no chance of it being knocked out. Well, what do you think? You think you can do it? I think you can. Just have a little patience, allow yourself plenty of time, and you can really have a nice hardwood floor. If you've gotten this far, you might want to consider sanding and finishing the floor yourself as well. If you do, why don't you pick up my tape on sanding and finishing hardwood floors? Bye for now. Well, I've been in the hardwood flooring business almost 15 years now, and it's not the easiest way to make a living. One of the ways I use to relax is to come home and feed my dog Kodiak here and feed my fish. Hey guys. Whoa. It's a beautiful setting. Really helps to ease the soul.